Today's video is sponsored in part by Collector Legion. Check out collectorlegion.com for all your MTG needs and more. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another round of Tuesday Night Legacy. Tonight we have Lands versus Painter. Let's get into it. On the left, we have Eric playing the control deck Lands. Now, this deck takes the typical strategy of trying to control your opponent out of the game with oppressive spells and doing it instead with oppressive lands, taking advantage of the fact that you're not actually casting any spells, you are just using the abilities on these lands. The most important one, of course, being Urza's Saga, this being able to do all kinds of different things, either giving you an actual win condition with the constructs or finding important artifacts out of your deck that are 0 or 1 mana spells. And the card that Eric leans on the most in this deck is going to be Sphere of Resistance, which is going to make all spells cost an additional 1. So this is kind of like a Thalia Tax or a Thorn of Amethyst, except it's not just non-creature spells, it's everything. So this does also affect Eric, but not as much because he's running 34 lands. And so if you have... where's that card? A couple exploration in play that allow you to play extra lands per turn, then you are doing things that are very similar to spells, but you're not affected by the Sphere of Resistance. This deck has a couple ways to win. Instead of just hating out your opponent, you can use a crop rotation to turn your Dark Depths into your Merit Lage with the combo of the Dark Depths with the Thespian Stage, being able to copy a Thespian Stage into a Dark Depths that has no counters and then immediately turn that card into a 2020 flying indestructible avatar. This deck also takes advantage of the card Life from the Loam, which allows you to return lands from your graveyard to your hand, and also return this card to your hand from your graveyard with the Dredge ability. So you are basically never, ever, ever running out of gas. It's a slower deck, but as long as it can get its legs underneath it, this deck often turns out very good results. And on the right, you have Maxwell playing a good old mono red painter list. This is technically red-black, does run a couple of bad lands, and the Chaos Defiler, which is a red-black spell, but you're almost never casting this spell from your hand since it costs 5. The entire idea of this deck is to use the cards Goblin Engineer and Goblin Welder to put the important artifacts into your graveyard, like Grindstone, or the other important creature, Painter's Servant. So if you can get a Servant into your yard and, one of your... not City of Traders, but the Great Furnace, an artifact into play that doesn't cost that much, you can swap places with them with the Goblin Welder and immediately win the game by using the Painter Servant Grindstone combo, choosing a single color, turning all cards in all zones that one color, and then activating the Grindstone, which will mill the entire library, and when your opponent goes to draw, they lose. This deck has become very, very, very reliable with the printing of the card Urza's Saga, since you can play an Urza's Saga on turn 1 or turn 2. As long as you have a Painter Servant or a way to find a Painter Servant, the Urza's Saga just puts a Grindstone into play, and since it only costs 1 generic, it can't even be countered. So your opponent, if they're on blue and have a counterspell, it doesn't really matter because it doesn't actually involve the stack. They're going to have a Stifle or a Trick Bind in order to stop that from coming into play. The coolest part about this deck is as long as you have a Painter Servant in play, all of a sudden your Pyroblasts and your Red Elemental Blasts become 1 mana counterspells or destroy target permanent for literally anything in play, including basic lands, because those basic lands are blue if the Painter Servant is named on blue. So we have a control deck versus a combo deck. Let's get to those games. Players are shuffled up and ready to go. Let's go ahead and get these games started. We have Maxwell on turn 1 with the turn 1 Soul Guide Lantern. Just kind of throwing this out there. It's only a 1 of in the deck, but throwing that down on turn 1 against a graveyard deck, huge deal. This is actually going to matter a little bit for the opponent here because Life from the Loam is a card. Eric showing that off right out of the gate with the classic turn 1 play of Mox Diamond into pitch a land. Play a different land, cast Life from the Loam so you don't lose any advantage. Mox Diamond requiring you to discard a land in order to get into play. And now we have lost that first Life from the Loam. There are 3 others in the deck, but Maxwell decides that that is good enough to get rid of, since all he had to do was tap and sacrifice his Soul Guide Lantern. Max deploying the Fable of the Mirror Breaker, just a fantastic red card in general. Being able to create a 2/2 creature that makes treasures when it attacks, getting to bin some stuff out of your hand, kind of setting up for potentially winning with the combo if you have a Goblin Welder in play, and then the final creature is just a Kiki Jiki. You got to pay 1 mana for it, but it's really close to being able. It can just copy stuff. I mean, it copies a creature, you can get it till end of turn. All sorts of advantage. We're seeing a crop rotation from Eric here. I think he paid the green, sacked the taiga. It's going to turn it into a wasteland, getting rid of that ancient tomb. Makes sense. Being able to deploy a 3-cast on turn 2 was pretty good. And we see a second Life from the Loam deployed, which is going to pull back that wasteland. So the trigger for the saga goes on this stack when you get into main phase. So you draw your card, main phase. Max decides to bin a Simian Spirit Guide here to draw an extra card. We see 2 damage coming in and a treasure created. And Max wants that big advantage, so he plays another Ancient Tomb, even though he knows that Eric has the Wasteland in hand. I guess he's not super worried about it, because if Eric is wasting time blowing up his lands with no exploration in play, then he's not really doing anything else. And this is creating a lot of advantage for Max by having these 2/2s. And he's going to be able to even copy a 2/2, so he's crashing for 6. So getting more damage on the board is a good place to be, especially since Eric has to give up another one of his lands, the Urza Saga, having that trigger. It's going to go and find a 1 or 0 cast, but loses the land, so slight land disadvantage. It was colorless in the first place. We see an expedition map coming into play, so this is going to set up Eric to be able to basically get any land out of his deck that he wants. For 2 mana, though. We're seeing a ton of Life from the Loams in Eric's hand. Little awkward here, but he does have that exploration. This 1 mana representing, I think, the mana off of the Urza Saga, although that Life from the Loam was very, very good there, using the Wasteland to destroy Max's other Ancient Tomb, pulling back the Urza Saga he just lost to recoup that lost advantage. Although we are seeing Max crash in here for lots of damage, 4 damage, and another creature. A Painter's Servant enters play. Painter's Servant, of course, 1/2 of the combo. Eric feeling a little in trouble here now. I believe blue is the color always chosen, almost always, since you run all of those blasts in your main board for at least game 1. Making it now that, like I was talking about in the intro, Max now has 6 spells in his deck that can simply destroy permanents in play, counter any spell. And he does have 3 treasures, so he does have access to these counter spells. Eric trying to decide what he's going to do here. There's a Sphere of Resistance in his hand. Going to drop that into play. This is the time, if ever. Does not fire it off. And we see a Tabernacle of Pendrell Vale. And the Pyroblast destroys the Tabernacle instead. Paying that 2 mana to blow up that blue permanent. Because that was kind of threatening Max's playstate a lot more than the Sphere of Resistance. Since he does have a bunch of creatures in play, he's eventually going to close out the game with these creatures. Tabernacle would have made it so that Max had to pay 1 mana for each of his creatures at the beginning of his upkeep. Kind of putting a huge tax on Max. And Max identified this pretty quick and blew that up with the Pyroblast. We see Eric dredging the Life from the Loam back from his hand, paying 2 mana to cast Life from the Loam. Pointed out that Sphere of Resistance actually makes Life from the Loam cost 3, and that was actually enough of attacks that Eric gave up that first game, decided to go to game 2. A turn 1 Sphere of Resistance from Eric. Getting serious about putting pressure on his opponent, making it much more difficult to get things into play. We see the Goblin Welder enter the battlefield. Just an Urza Saga for Eric. Goblin Welder going to be the one that exchanges artifacts either in a one-player controls for target artifact in that player's graveyard. So you can actually do this to your opponent if they fulfill both of those requirements. Wouldn't that be fun? Like, I don't know. It'd probably be bad to do this, but if there was an expedition map in Eric's graveyard, then or like a Pithing Needle or something, then he could exchange it for the Sphere of Resistance in play. Then his spells wouldn't cost as much. Or the opposite. If he's got Pithing Needle named on Grindstone or something, that'd be cool. We see Max play another Urza Saga and get a Painter Servant into play for 3 mana. Eric makes a Ditto at the end of turn. One of those constructs off of the Urza Saga. This is an XX equal to the number of artifacts in play on your side. So Eric's construct is a 2/2. If Max wanted to make one, it would be a 3/3. I believe we are in the beginning of main phase. A crop rotation. That's got to be a crop rotation with the Urza Saga trigger on the stack. So he's basically going to get a land and he's going to get the 0 or 1 mana artifact cost. This is a maximum benefit usage of an Urza Saga. Plus the mana that it produced. I think he used the mana it produced in order to cast it, since crop rotation would cost 2 because of the Sphere of Resistance. We're seeing an Expedition map into play here, and a Wasteland as the crop-rotated land. Feeling it's mighty important to get rid of that Urza Saga. I 100% agree, as Grindstone was coming into play that next turn. And with 3 mana, he could have activated it too. A Tabernacle being another land, the land for turn for Eric. Looks like Max decided to sack his Painter Servant, which is fine, because as long as he can get another artifact into play, he can weld it back. Eric has a Lightning Bolt, but has no red mana. So a mildly awkward situation. Sorry for that abrupt transition, folks. Had to go and find the third game. So with a scoop from Maxwell, we are into game 3. Here we go. Just a red mana to start from Max, past the turn. And we're seeing a Wasteland from Eric, threatening anything else coming into play here. Now, that is a fairly decent play. Wow. Okay, so we see the Magus of the Moon enter the battlefield, turning everything red. Eric says, that's great. Here's my Lightning Bolt for your Magus. And things are just fine once again. Moving on. See the Wasteland for the Ancient Tomb. 2 red mana gets a Painter Servant. Dark Depths being the only land in play. Does technically have 10 counters on it. I guess they just decided that don't really need it. Yavimaya is going to turn all of these lands into forests, as well as anything else. It's all the way down here. Being able to tap the Dark Depths for green mana at this point to get that Sylvan Library into play. I think that must be the Great Furnace. Yeah, so this is the artifact land. It's also going to tap for red. Artifact lands, of course, being the giant mistake of the Mirrodin block. Back when that all got printed, making Affinity one of the best decks in Standard. maybe ever, at least as far as standard power levels are concerned. I skipped playing during that time. So we see Eric trying to decide what he's going to do with this Sylvan Library trigger. Looking at his 3 cards, Urza's Saga. I don't know what this card is that he's hemming and hawing about. We see a Tabernacle and a Wasteland. Yeah, I really can't tell what that card is. So he ends up drawing the Urza Saga and playing it. Eric, I think, pretty scared here that a Grindstone is going to come down at any given moment. Although Max is 1 mana off of actually activating the Grindstone. Grindstone costing 1 to put into play, but 3 to activate. I'm going to Wasteland the Great Furnace, bringing Max less and less mana. Painter's Servant, of course, crashing in for 1 here. We do see the Grindstone entering play. Max only on 2 mana here. So Tabernacle isn't a very good play right now because it can just respond with the upkeep trigger to activate it. Although only having 2 mana in play, it is a bit of a gamble that Max doesn't have a Simian Spirit Guide in hand. We see Eric floating some mana, a crop rotation. And Max picks it up. I'm not entirely certain. Oh, there's a Force of Vigor in Eric's hand. So 1, 2, and then maybe going and getting an Ancient Tomb so he can just cast. Yeah, so Ancient Tomb being able to provide the 2 extra mana. Force of Vigor costing 4, so he could have just hard cast Force of Vigor and blown up both of Max's combo pieces, and Max scoops the game, and that's the end. Eric takes it 2-1. Hey, thanks for sticking around to listen to me talk. If this is your first time here, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel so you can always stay up to date on all of our cool stuff. Thanks to Spellhold Games and Collector Legion for allowing us to record in their play space. We wouldn't exist without you. And if you are around this coming Tuesday, it is a streaming Tuesday. So it's going to be actually me in the booth with Jesse, also known as Spite Plays on Twitch, I believe. And if you want to listen to us talk about some matches of Legacy, please come and join us at the Tuesday Night Legacy YouTube channel. Yes, the very same thing that you are watching right now. If you want to know more about these decks, they are always in the description of this video, and if you want to see those visual deck lists, they are going to be on the Instagram channel of Tuesday Night Legacy eventually. That's going to do it for us for this week. As always, I am Eugene, and this is Tuesday Night Legacy. We'll see you next time.